Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Gary Baumgarten, but I expect you already know that, and I welcome you to this edition of this discussion on Facebook Live, paltalk.com, and on YouTube. And you know, a lot of people in the past, in growing numbers, have begun homeschooling their children, certainly not a majority, and certainly controversial to do so still in our society. But this coronavirus has changed all that. The numbers of people who are schooling their children at home or through long distance learning has really increased. And that was at the end of the school year that started. Now we are looking already, I hate to ruin it for everybody who says, oh yeah, it's summer, but it's already time to start looking at the fall. And there are a lot of discussions about whether or not we should be returning our children to school. We all know that the president is pushing it. We know that others, including teacher unions, ironically, because it's their jobs across the nation, are arguing against it. And I know that parents are struggling over whether they feel comfortable sending their children back. And as a result of that, we are seeing an influx in the number of people who are showing interest in homeschooling. So I thought it would be terrific today to invite to us somebody who's right in the thick of it and has been for years. Tim Lambert is the president of the Texas Homeschool Coalition, and we're going to talk about whether or not he suggests we send our kids back to school. Tim Lambert, welcome to our discussion.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Good to have you. So let's get right to it and ask you, do you think it's a good idea for us to be sending our children to school given the pandemic?
You know, one of the things that I tell people is people ought to do what they think is best for their children. And what we're seeing in Texas now is that our call volume of the people who are interested has almost tripled in the last couple of weeks as the Texas Education Agency has put out their new guidelines in terms of school starting and having in-person classes. And so we see this fear is driving people. Some people are very concerned about the virus. Other people are very concerned about what the schools are going to require in terms of masks and social distancing. So, you know, there's only about 3% of the school-age students in the country that are being homeschooled. And yet there are polls showing 40 to 50, even 60% of families are actually considering continuing to do that instead of sending their kids back to public schools in the fall.
So how do I ensure, and we were kind of discussing this before we went on air about my experience as a parent. My children are grown now, but this was something that my ex-wife and I would talk about at the time. How can we ensure that people like me and my wife, we are relatively intelligent people, but we're certainly not trained teachers. How can we ensure that our children are properly educated when they're being taught at home?
You know, back in the 80s, when we started homeschooling, that was really the challenge. We had an Attorney General of Texas at one time say that he didn't believe parents were qualified to raise their kids, much less teach them at home.
Well, in some cases that may be true, but you can't take every kid away from every parent.
That's true. The interesting thing is the data shows some interesting things about homeschooling. It shows, first of all, that homeschool kids score 15 to 30 points above the national average on standardized test scores compared to their classroom counterparts. The other thing it shows is that in a traditional classroom, economics, income of a family, and educational background generally are the determining factors for education outcomes of a child, but that is not true among homeschooling parents. And I think it comes down to the fact that you have the tutorial approach. You've got that one-on-one attention. And, you know, if you're dealing with elementary age kids, you can do in a couple of hours what it takes a classroom setting all day long to do.
Well, you know, I think one of the other things is, and I'm just speculating here, you probably would, I mean, you obviously would know better than I. I've done a lot of coverage of charter schools, some of which are very successful, some of which are not. But the one thing that the charter schools, and I like looking at the ones that don't pick and choose the children. I like to look at the models that pick just from the same base of potential students as the public school down the street. So we're not comparing a pool of apples with oranges. They're apples and apples. The same socioeconomics, the same range of intellect, whatever that might be. And because it's not fair to look at those that are picking and choosing just the exceptionally bright children. And the one leg that I think that they have up on the public schools, one of many legs, but the one shining leg is the parents cared enough to send their children to that school, hoping that that child would have a better educational opportunity. In other words, the parent is more engaged. And I would suspect that when it comes to homeschooling, right on the face of it, the parent has to be more engaged, because if he or she is not, the child's not going to get educated.
Yes, that is very typically true. You know, every educator will tell you that the key to a child's successful education is engaged parents, and you don't get much more engaged than homeschooling. The interesting thing today is that with technology, there are so many opportunities, online schools, online classes. And the other interesting thing about the homeschool community, you know, our detractors used to point at our education success of our children and say, well, it's just white rich people who are homeschooling. The latest studies by the U.S. Department of Education show that 40% of the homeschool community is minority. The largest growing segment of the homeschool community now is Black families. So I think that that growth gives kind of the evidence that these are parents who are very engaged and very dedicated to raising their children.
So the other issue that always comes up, and we discussed this as well before we began our live stream here, Tim Lambert, the president of the Texas Homeschool Coalition, is that the issue, of course, of socialization. How does one address that when one is instructing one's child at home?
Yeah, you know, we on the homeschool community, we always call that, oh, that's the socialization question. It always comes up. And the interesting thing about that is typically that conversation comes up when we're talking about young children. And so what you usually hear is about kindergarten or elementary age kids. How are these kids going to learn to get along in the world? And if you've had children, you know, we all know that when your child spends most of their day with 30 other little 5-year-olds, what they learn is not really the stuff that you want a 5-year-old to learn. And so by experience and also the academic studies, homeschoolers are at least as well socialized as their classroom counterparts, very often more socialized. And you understand that whenever you get out of school, that's the last time that you'll spend the majority of your day with 20 or 30 other people that are your chronological age. And a homeschooler spends his day with people that are younger and older than him, and that's really much more of a typical environment.
You know, I happen to own a conversion van. It was my dream all through life, and I finally was able to purchase one. But in the investigating part of all this to determine what van I really wanted, what kind of a lifestyle I wanted when I was on the road, I did a lot of research. And today, that kind of research is at the tip of your fingers on YouTube. And I've followed a lot of people who are actually full-timers. I'm not full-time, but I happen to follow a lot of people who are full-timers. You learn all the pitfalls, and they're very generous. And I imagine in homeschooling, you have that as well. People share information with one another within the community. And I was attracted to, and I began to follow several families where they're taking their children full-time on the road, either driving across America or shipping their van or renting a van in Europe and traveling across Europe. And what I saw, what I found very amazing, and it kind of opened my eyes, and they're obviously homeschooling or van schooling their children, is that they've taken them to places that you read about in the books. And in our country, you could go to any park service park, and there's going to be a ranger there who will bring the history alive and answer the child's questions in a way that the teacher really can't, because they're immersed in it. And one of the places I saw a family go to is in your own state, the Alamo, which,
Yep.
you know, to me, it's just a concept, the Alamo. And I know about the Alamo from what I've read. But when they walk through the Alamo and they talk to the guides at the Alamo, it was an enriching experience for the children. I would really like to be able to see how those kids turn out.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We have personal friends who renovated a bus and are traveling across the country doing that. And I think that is typical of what the homeschool experience is like. Rather than being in a classroom where you're really pushed to cover a material and to get through with that lesson or that book, in homeschooling, you have this low teacher-student ratio. You can really delve into the things that children are excited about. My own wife was desperately trying to teach my teenage son, who was 14, to write. He hated English. So she basically said, why don't you write an essay about all the different baseball stadiums across the country? So she connected an interest with that academics, and it turned out really well. And I just think that's typical. These homeschoolers find a way to make this learning very interesting and life-changing.
Well, obviously, your wife knows your son better than a teacher would know your son, and she knew which button to push in order to get him excited.
Yes, that's exactly right, and that is typical. And we do have, you know, in the old days, in the 80s and 90s, we had support groups. We go to meetings, and today almost all these groups are on Facebook or electronically, and there's just a tremendous amount of support out there.
Texas Homeschool Coalition President Tim Lambert, I want to conclude our discussion by circling back to the very beginning, the premise of why we are together today right now, and that is the pandemic. And unfortunately for you, and I understand it, I live in New Jersey and I work in New York City, and we were the ones that got slammed. This was the epicenter in the beginning, and now Texas seems to be right in the thick of things right now. So I would suspect that there are a lot of parents, whether they're planning on homeschooling their children or not, who are saying, I don't care what the rules are. And I know that today, by the way, in Texas, they've changed the rules. They're backtracking a little bit on requiring people to send their children to school. They're offering some wiggle room there for parents. But I would suspect even before that there are a lot of parents who have been saying in Texas, there's no way I'm sending my child to school given what's happening around me. Is that the case? And are you and others like you being just slammed with requests for information right now?
Yes, we are. So in the first 2 weeks of July, we have fielded twice as many calls as we fielded the whole month of July last year. And the Texas Education Agency made some announcements. It's kind of kicked that off, and they're going to come out again next week. But you're exactly right. We do have parents for different reasons who are concerned and looking into this. And so we're glad to help people. We have a couple of websites. The homeeducator.com is a national website, and the Texas Homeschool, thsc.org is our state website. And so we're fielding lots of calls, and we expect to see a dramatic increase in the number of families who are choosing to teach their kids at home this year.
Well, I know there's an argument, which, by the way, is not holding true because this thing is progressing in a different way right now than it was in the beginning of this pandemic, that children are disproportionately unaffected. But the reality is that even if a child is asymptomatic and has the COVID, he or she can bring that home to mom and dad from the school. So the kid may not actually get sick, even though they are sick. They may not have any symptoms. They can bring it home to people who might have health problems and are higher risk. And I would think that if I were a parent today, I would be hard pressed to be convinced to send my child to school because of this pandemic.
Well, I think there are a lot of parents who think exactly like you just stated. And, you know, we believe that God gave kids to parents and families, and parents should be able to make the decisions for their children, whether that's their education or medical decisions. And so we're just happy that Texas, at least at this point, is very homeschool friendly and giving parents those options to make those kinds of decisions for their kids.
Well, they're right up against it. They have to make the decisions. Are you going to go buy the back to school clothes and supplies, or are you going to check in and figure out in your own state how you're able to legally homeschool your child, or long distance schooling of your child? And I guess, the jury is out right now on how successful that's going to be. But what I would like to do maybe is, as the school year progresses, check in with you again. I'm sure the audience is going to want to know how this all pans out and how many more people actually do revert, or not revert, but decide to homeschool. Actually, it is a reversion in a way, because the time in our country, I didn't mean to use the word, but as I think about it, there was a time in our country that people, the main book that people used as a textbook was the Bible. That's how they taught their children how to read and write. So maybe this is going back to our roots a little bit. But I'd love to check back in with you, Tim Lambert, to see how things progress and how many people really are now homeschooling their children. It may double or even more in terms of your numbers. Well,
I'll be happy to visit with you. And of course, folks can go to thsc.org in Texas or homeeducator.com nationally and get more information. And love to check back with you anytime. And you're right. 100 years ago in Texas, homeschooling was the norm. So it hasn't been that long ago from a long-term standpoint that people were really homeschooling as a regular thing. Right. And I'm not trying to slam public schools. I'm the product of the public school system. Maybe that's not a, maybe I'm not a good example of that. I don't know, but I think I turned out pretty okay. And my children are both products of the public school system. But I know that, we keep saying in many respects, not just when it comes to education, that things have changed in not just our country, in our world because of this pandemic. And probably a lot of things will never go back to the way they were before. And so we are adapting as a nation to the new reality, and maybe homeschooling is a bigger part of that as a result. I think you're exactly right. Things have changed for good, and homeschooling is going to be a big part of that, I think. Tim Lambert, the president of the Texas Homeschool Coalition, thanks for giving us your time, and for everybody else, and also you, Tim. Everybody have a safe weekend, and as I like to say at the end of our discussions, peace out. Thanks, Gary.